Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I want to welcome you all to the Woodrow Wilson Center. My name is Jeff DeBelco, and I am fortunate enough to direct the Environmental Change and Security Program here at the Center. And we are very pleased to be partnering once again with Columbia University's SESIN in having a discussion today that we've entitled The World Cities, Mapping Urban Growth in Developing Countries. Bob Chen, whom you will hear from in a moment, the director of SESIN, is someone, he and his colleagues, that we have worked with quite a while and really appreciate the opportunity to collaborate. And in fact, what we're doing today is piggybacking on a users working group meeting that one of Bob's key programs is having here at the center for a couple days, a big NASA program. So it's a thrill to see all of those folks here in the room, but also to engage with the policy and the practice community that we try to do here at the Wilson Center. Those of you who are new haven't heard me say a million times, like those who are regulars have, that here at the Wilson Center is the former memorial to Wilson. We are trying to bridge these worlds of scholarship and policy because they both have a lot to learn from one another. And as Wilson is our only president with a PhD, the Congress decided to set up this nonpartisan, non-advocacy institute to try to do exactly that, be a living memorial where these worlds can come together. The Environmental Change and Security Program, we are I think we're in our 15th year now trying to do this same bridging process, dialogue process, with a broad mandate around environment, health, population, development, and then at times within a foreign policy and a security policy context. So I think you will hear a lot as we delve into the demographic and land use change, environmental aspects of the urban landscape. You'll hear a lot of these themes coming to the fore. We are, on the Wilson Center side, thankful yet again to have the sustained support from USAID's Office of Population and Reproductive Health, and it's great to see a number of folks from that office here that make these meetings possible for us to do. I will say just a quick word that we're webcasting today's event live, and really all that means for you folks is that when it comes to the Q&A that we'll do after both Mark and Karen give their presentations, I ask that you wait for one of my colleagues to bring a microphone so the folks online can hear your question. Those of you who are watching online, I think you'll be able to, if you can't already, shortly access the PowerPoints on the website so that you can see the slides more easily that way as well. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Bob Chen, who, as I said, directs SESIN at Columbia University. Bob can introduce our speakers and tell you a little bit about SESIN. So thank you very much, Bob. Please, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks, Jeff, and appreciate your hosting this and helping to arrange it. It's a real opportunity for us to come down to Washington and meet with a larger group than we expected, plus a whole web audience out there that I wasn't really thinking about originally. Maybe our speakers hadn't either. I won't go into a lot about SESIN. I hope you've heard about us. We're actually in our 20th year since we were created originally as a nonprofit in Michigan. We've been at Columbia University for a little over 10 years. And we're a research center there within the Earth Institute. We are pleased that through our NASA advisory group, we were able to meet here. Both Karen and Mark are members of this group. The chair, Harlan, where'd you go? I saw you walk in. Harlan Onsrud from the University of Maine is the chair, and there's another dozen people here from that committee. But it's a good opportunity for us to talk, first of all, about the data that we produce and get a sense of where the science is and where the uses of these data are. So that's one of the purposes of this kind of interaction. And we certainly are interested in broader comments about some of our data and how they're used and how they fit into issues like looking at urbanization around the world. So without further ado, we have the two speakers who I think are going to present first, and then, as Jeff said, have a discussion session. And we're pleased to have the first speaker, Mark Montgomery. He's someone actually we've collaborated on in some of our spatial data urban projects in the past. He's with the Population Council and a professor in the economics department at the State University of New York at Stony Brook. I think you have this bio, so I won't go into gory detail on the rest, and because you really want to hear them, not me. And then Karen Seto is a professor at the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, although you probably know that she spent a long time at Stanford University, and just as an aside, she was, my son took a course from her and everything, and was really excited about this urbanization stuff, and she's trying to get him to go to Yale, but you know. And she has also been involved in some of the international global change land projects over the years, and involved in work on China as well as other areas. So again, we're really thankful to have both of them speak, and why don't we just dive in. Thanks.
Thanks, Jeff and Bob. Let me pull this up. Well, I'd like to talk with you this afternoon about two of the great trends of our time, urbanization and climate change. And these come together in interesting ways and in challenging ways that will present to all of us new demands of various sorts, including new demands for data and for methods. We know from the United Nations that the era we're entering into is one in which there will be enormous growth in the urban populations of poor countries. This is mainly a growth that will be experienced in the poor countries of the world. From 2000 to 2024, those poor countries, LDCs as in this slide, added about 1.6 billion urban residents. And something of the same increase is in store for those countries in the quarter century following. Meanwhile, to judge from the forecasts of the UN Population Division that inform this slide, the era of rural growth in these countries is evidently coming to an end, and even decline is evidently in store. Well, while this is happening, as we all know, the world will also, it seems, be undergoing a period of increase in global temperature and all the ramifications that follow from that. And poor countries will be challenged, let us say euphemistically, by both of these trends. In those countries, a number of levels and units of government, ranging from the national to the regional or state, down to the municipal and even below that, will need to formulate urban adaptation to climate change strategies that are spatially specific. They must be spatially specific if those needs are going to be addressed on the ground. Now, in the natural sciences community, earth sciences and so forth, there's an enormous effort underway to document and refine estimates of exposure to climate risks that are increasingly on a more and more spatially refined basis. Well, what about those of us in the social science community? What are we doing in a parallel fashion to document vulnerability to these risks, especially in the cities of poor countries? Well, at the moment, we are doing very little in the social science communities. And that is, in a way, the larger theme of this talk, that it's time to get in gear. Just to draw the point out a bit further, a feature of urbanization is that over time, as countries become more and more urbanized, higher and higher percentages of the populations of those countries will be found in relatively small, dense units. In the world of demography, I'm an economist and demographer myself, we've, for the past 30 years, relied, now it appears to a fault, on national level representative sample surveys to tell us what is happening within a given country in terms of demographic behavior, health behavior and outcomes, and so forth. Now, those national level surveys are helpful. They do have something to say that's useful about the determinants of city growth. But we really cannot ask nationally representative surveys to tell us anything very meaningful about individual cities and, of course, the neighborhoods within those cities. That's not the point, the purpose for which these surveys are designed. So if we are to ready ourselves to meet an era in which climate change joins with urbanization, we'll have to do two things within the social sciences at a minimum. First, let's make use, in order to understand the sources and the likely implications, rates, and so forth of urban growth, let's use what we have at hand. There is, as I'll tell you in a few moments, a wealth of information that's been amassed over the last 20 to 30 years that will be useful in this regard, that will help us specify and better forecast models of city growth. The second large task that awaits us in the social science community is, again, to work with data we either have or shortly will have in the next round of censuses. That is to disaggregate these censuses, to get them broken down, very simple thing to do in principle at least, get them disaggregated down to the levels that are politically, bureaucratically, and programmatically meaningful, that is, to small political jurisdictions. This is not being done outside Latin America on a routine basis. There's nothing especially daunting about the task, but it needs to happen if we are to document vulnerability at a finely resolved spatial scale. So, with that overview, what I'll talk about in the next few minutes, and I think I have about 20 minutes in total. Let me give you a sense of the empirical materials that we have that we can have access to. I'll organize these materials, draw them together under the heading of climate change with two particular ecosystems or zones in mind. One, the low elevation coastal zone, on which SESIN has done a great deal of work. The second, not as much discussed in the literature, but I think very interesting to think about, are the urban populations residing in drylands, which, as it will turn out, are in fact much more, those areas are much more populous than that low elevation coastal zone. We'll go through a series of maps, that is snapshots of at a point in time, roughly 2000. I'll briefly describe what can be done to help forecast city growth by ecosystem and other parameters, and then conclude. So the team that has produced this work is one that's been together for 5 or so years. Deborah Balk, formerly at SESIN, now at Columbia. Thomas Buettner at the UN Population Division, Gordon McGranahan at IIED in London, and a number of others you see here are responsible. So what we do in gathering together materials for this exercise is to draw on each of three enormous projects underway for at least a decade. First, the Global Rural Urban Mapping Project, which is familiar to everyone in the first couple of rows, but which may not be known to all of you in the audience. Its elements I'll describe shortly. Second, the United Nations Cities Database. And third, an enormous mass of demographic surveys collected initially by the World Fertility Surveys program in the 1970s, and then since the mid-1980s by the Demographic and Health Surveys program. And also, to give you at least a sense of how one might begin to quantify vulnerability, we'll take a look at yet another spatially specific exercise in which SESIN's been engaged, along with the World Bank, the Small Area Poverty Mapping Project. So GRUMP, or the Global Rural Urban Mapping Project, for those of you who don't know it, I briefly describe it here. The essential point is that this project provides the essential spatial frame for our analysis. And GRUMP really has no counterpart at the moment. It is essentially a unique resource, I think, and one that's unusual in the world of population, I must say. The UN Cities Database provides the time series aspect of the project. It has collected since the 1970s short time series on thousands of cities in developing countries. And the third source of information, as I mentioned, is the enormous collection of nationally representative population surveys under the DHS and WFS programs. These help us to understand the sources of city growth by documenting urban fertility rates, which I find are surprisingly seldom thought about as drivers of city growth rates. In fact, they are extremely important in driving city growth. Migration is well recognized as important in city growth, yet in these surveys, unfortunately, it's very crudely measured, to say the least. There's also, some of you may know of UNICEF's Multiple Indicators Cluster Surveys, another large program. We will be adding those to our set. Well, to draw together then these materials in a discussion of urbanization and climate change. The low elevation coastal zone, that is the area contiguous to the ocean that's, in this instance, within 10 meters of sea level. That is, the LECZ, as it's known, can be thought of as a proxy for the risks that populations will be exposed to that have a seaward character. Sea level rise, storm surges, precipitation, landslides that sometimes produces, and so forth. This picture, derived from GRUMP, is of southern Vietnam. And you can see in light blue the ocean, in slightly darker blue the low elevation coastal zone. And what you see under that blue is practically the entirety of southern Vietnam, including about half of Ho Chi Minh City lies within this low elevation coastal zone. If we look elsewhere in Asia and ask, does climate change put economic assets at risk? Well, here is a snapshot of China's immensely powerful economic engine, much of which, for example, in Shanghai, Shenzhen, is located in the low elevation coastal zone and will thus be exposed, increasingly it seems over the years, to storm surges, typhoons, and so forth. Now, it's not, the low elevation coastal zone is in a way an obvious arena in which climate change will be linked with urbanization. Less often talked about, but is the ecosystem known as the drylands ecosystem, okay, which in brief is much more populous than the low elevation coastal zone, is about half urban, okay, and as the name suggests, is the kind of ecosystem in which we expect to see increasing water stress, water scarcity. Okay. Much of the literature is about the implications of those developments for the rural populations of the drylands. Perhaps increased migration and so forth. Much less has been written about the urban implications. What does it mean to be a resident of a city in the drylands? Does it mean increasing water scarcity, less by way of hydropower? Does it mean an influx of short-term or longer-term migrants from rural areas of the zone? So to give you an image of where the drylands are, well, we see, among other things, northern Mexico, southern Africa, parts of Argentina, West Asia, and so forth. And if we draw specific attention to India, I hope this is reasonably clear, the darker areas are the more arid areas of that country. Delhi lies in the drylands zone, as does Hyderabad. This picture also, although you can probably only dimly make this out, shows us Mumbai and Calcutta, which have large portions of their populations in the low elevation coastal zone. So India offers, the full menu of risks here. I'll briefly put up this slide and leave it for those interested to take a look at later. What we have done using the materials provided by GRUMP, the UN, and so forth, is to simply quantify the numbers of people, in this case in Asia, the numbers of urban residents in Asia, and also the amount of land, the number of people who reside in the LECZ and the numbers residing in the drylands. Right? And although I doubt you can see any of that detail from where you are, if you look at the numbers involved, the basic message of this table is that the numbers of urban residents in dryland systems is much larger than is the case with the low elevation coastal zone. So this is an area, this is a kind of ecosystem and in which I think we need to take an interest, even if our interest is mainly for the implications for urban residents. Okay. We can also, using these spatially specific materials, go down from the country level to the level of cities or urban agglomerations. There's a map shown here of the third largest city of Indonesia, Medan. The outlines that you see are from the satellite imagery, the nighttime lights imagery that indicate the outlines of the urban agglomeration where population excuse me, and production are likely to be concentrated. Beneath that, well, the ocean is to your upper right. The low elevation coastal zone is the green area, and beneath that are various administrative units on which SESIN in this GRUMP project has gathered information on population. So if you, all those irregularly shaped shapes beneath the low elevation coastal zone, we can add up, if we like, the population living in those areas and get an estimate of the numbers of people exposed to this particular kind of climate-related risk. Oh, thanks, Jeff. Losing it there. But having got this spatial frame that GRUMP has made available for us, we can also put other spatially coded information into it. A number of you may know of the World Bank's Small Area Poverty Mapping project. That involved a combination of census data, microcensus data, and other kinds of data, which produced, at the level of relatively small geographic units, estimates of the number and proportion poor. In what amounts to, I think, about 50 to 60 countries by now. So we have one of these small area poverty maps available to us for Medan. And you can see here the low elevation coastal zone. Beneath that is an indicator of the proportion poor in the neighborhoods that are at risk. And if we like, we can switch our analysis to the numbers of people who are poor. And so for various types of work, it's this kind of information. The poor are likely to be, of course, more vulnerable to climate-related threats. We can at least begin to quantify the numbers involved. And here I'll pass through this quickly, but we try to, for the cases where it can be done, much as here, we try to give an indication of poverty rates within the low elevation coastal zone and outside that zone. Okay, well, let me turn now to the last major point, which is if we've seen snapshots of climate-related risks zones circa 1995, 2000, 2005, what about the future? Do these materials, if combined, offer us a better understanding of the likely evolution of city sizes and city growth rates in the years to come? And here we'll need to rely on the United Nations Population Division's cities database for the time series dimension, without which forecasting would not be a sensible exercise. As discussed in this rather technical slide, among the data that need to be fed into such estimates and forecasts, we must have, I would say, information on urban fertility rates. Total fertility rates is what's said here, because these are demonstrably a very important determinant of rates of city growth. We must also have other kinds, and it would be desirable to have a great range of such other information, including information on ecozones and ecosystems and other geographically related variables. Okay. I'll just briefly show you, for those whose lunch would not be complete without an equation, the kind of thing, the kind of model that we have estimated, regression model that's suitable for longitudinal data. Okay. And from that kind of exercise, we can come away with these sorts of illustrative forecasts. What I'm showing here is for Asia, based on the inputs you've seen just very briefly there. And based also on the United Nations forecasts of total fertility rates over the next decades, what would we produce by way of forecasts of city growth? The red line shows you on the panel on the left the median forecasted city growth rate over the period in question, which ranges from over 3%, about 3.5% in 2000, down to 2-something percent by the end of the forecast period. Right? Now, what is pulling down the rate of city growth over time? It's the decline in fertility. In this comparison, we ask, well, are city growth rates forecast to be higher in the low elevation coastal zones than elsewhere? And the answer is, although there is a barely discernible difference between the two, the difference doesn't amount to much as the forecast horizon increases. Right? So as best we can tell at the moment, cities in those low elevation zones are growing no more rapidly nor less rapidly than our cities located elsewhere, with other things held constant. So to conclude, we need to ask the question, I think, about trends, about forecasts, because these forecasts are, of course, essential to planning and to devising urban adaptation strategies. And one question of interest to those of us here on the user working group in particular is, how ambitious should these forecasts strive to be? I think it was Sam Preston, a noted, quite eminent demographer, who wrote about 30 years ago that projection of city populations is fraught with hazards, impossible to predict precisely, and as he said, national and local planners will have access to more detailed information about a particular place than we do, those of us who are involved in international data sets. He also wrote that with reference to Mexico City, which back then was forecast to reach a total of 31 million persons by the year 2000, which of course never happened. Whether such size can actually be attained is of course questionable, he says, pointing to issues with water supply, tree cover, and other sorts of natural or environmental factors. So those are sound advice, don't be too ambitious. And yet, if you ask, well, what's happened in the 30 years since Sam Preston and the UN Population Division wrote those words? Well, one of the things that has happened, and especially so in the last decade, is a remarkable outpouring of new data, some of which I've shown you, that if carefully, cautiously combined, might very well enable us to make better informed forecasts of city growth than the best scientists of the 1980s could have imagined at the time. There is a tendency to think that surely it really is the local specialists, local planners who have information on the detail and will know, and they will know, of course, far more than we about the prospects of certain neighborhoods and cities in their areas. But I think there's a tendency to overstate what is known locally, right? In some countries, in Latin America, South Africa, a few poor countries, there is and has been a lot of investment in the analysis and compilation of spatially detailed information. Right? But in most of the countries in which we work, local planners, even national planners, operate with the most rudimentary sorts of information about population and social and economic composition, and with very little understanding, I think it's fair to say, of the roles that factors such as fertility rates may play in the future evolution of city sizes and growth rates. So I would conclude that there is, in fact, an urgent and important role to be played by internationally assembled spatially specific data sets, such as those that CDAC and SESIN have been involved in. So let me conclude on that note, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. I think we'll turn straight to Karen.
Well, whereas Mark talked about people, I'm actually going to spend the bulk of my time talking about the land where people live. What I like to do today is talk about what we know and what we don't know. And really, the post-colonic phrase of my title, From Local to Global Patterns of Urban Land Use Change, what we know and don't know, really should be, and what are the implications of not knowing what we should know. So Mark has just shot a bunch of holes into what I think we do know. So these are estimates of global population projections under various scenarios. And you can see that there's a huge range, ranging from 7.8 to 11.9 billion people by 2050. And if we look at population or urban population by region, we see that there's quite a variation across regions. If we look at the continents of, let's say, Latin America and North America, or Latin America is not a continent, but the regions, let's say, of Latin America and North America, we see that as recently as 1990, more than 70% of the population in Latin America lived in urban areas. And in North America, very, very similar. Something like 75% of people in North America live in urban areas. In contrast, if we look at Asia and Africa, only about 33 or 34% in both of those continents, and it's expected that these are the regions where urban population growth will be the greatest over the next 20 to 30 years. So that's the people side, where these folks distributed worldwide, and this is where SESIN has done really a significant amount of work mapping where urban settlements are. This is an example of the kinds of data sets that SESIN's developed. And you can see that, not surprisingly, there are lots of settlements in India, eastern China, around the eastern seaboard. And if we look at these settlements in closer detail, and again, these are data sets produced by SESIN, we can see where they are located in terms of ecosystems. So we can see where settlements are vis-a-vis cultivated lands, in coastal zones, etc. And if we want to zoom in further to the subglobal level, to national levels, we see that, again, SESIN has produced a number of maps, data sets of population density across the world. But what these maps don't show are the variations in these estimates in terms of the size and even the locations of where urban settlements are. And this is a graph taken by a study done by David Potter and Anne-Marie Schneider, where they compared estimates of urban settlements using a variety of different data sets. And the take-home message here is, whether you use GRUMP or whether you use some of NASA's assets from MODIS, or whether you use Landscan data set or the nighttime lights data set, you get very different estimates of the spatial extent and certainly the spatial pattern of urbanization. So there is one of the things that we don't know. We think that we know, but we don't know the spatial configuration of urban areas. Basic information, I think. The other thing that we don't know is we know very little about land use change. So Marx talked about city growth and urban growth really as a demographic process. I'm thinking about urban growth as a land change process. And what are the ecosystems at risk? Where are the farmlands most likely to be converted? The biodiversity hotspots that are closest to urban areas. So there's very little understanding about global rates of urban land use change. And one of the things that's, I think, particularly surprising for me is we actually have very little understanding about how urban areas have changed historically, despite more than 30 years of satellite data. So we don't really know how urban areas have developed. Are they growing more expansively? The term urban sprawl always gives me the heebie-jeebies because I don't really know what that means, but it's used extensively. So we don't know how urban areas are growing. We don't know where they're growing. Are they becoming more compact in nature? And if we don't understand the past, someone very clever once said we're very likely to repeat it in the future. This is a graph taken from Mark's paper in Science last year, which shows that most of the growth in the coming decades is actually going to occur in small and medium-sized cities. And so here's another point that I want to leave with you this afternoon is we actually know very little about small and medium-sized cities. We know quite a bit about the Shanghais, the Mexico cities, the New York cities of the world, but these smaller towns and smaller cities where a majority of the growth will take place in the coming decades are regions that are not being monitored very consistently. So my group previously at Stanford and now at Yale we've done local scale studies across the world, but primarily in Asia. And I just want to highlight, I'm not going to show all of these, I'm going to highlight a couple of case studies that we've done. And one of the things that we've taken away from these local-based case studies is that despite very different national and local policies, economic policies, very different demographic patterns, there are some common themes that are emerging in these growing regions. This is a picture taken from South China, provided by the Shenzhen Planning Bureau. This is a region just north of Hong Kong. This is a picture taken in early 1970s, and it's a region that primarily was agricultural, very much could be described as a town. And this is a picture taken just a few years ago. It is literally a region that has gone from a fishing community to one of the largest manufacturing hubs in China. And these are the images or the physical manifestation of urban population growth. So this is one of my favorite pictures that I took in the mid-90s there, something that's straight out of Southern California, but now being transplanted not only in South China, but really we're seeing this style of low-density single-family homes all around Asia where we're working. And then we're also seeing these McMansion-style developments that are quite impressive, I think would be quite impressive to most North Americans. So what do these patterns of urban land use change look like? I'm going to show a series of animations from our case studies. I'm going to start off in South China in the Pearl River Delta. The pictures that I just showed you were taken here in Shenzhen. This is the capital city of Guangzhou of the southern province of Guangdong. And this is an image from NASA's Landsat image taken in 1999. And we've been monitoring this area using data starting in 1973, and what you see in purple are the urban areas in 1973. And as we move through the animation through time, you can see that the area has grown significantly in terms of urban land change. And most of the land that's been converted to urban areas are primarily farmland, which is not surprising. So we'd been working in the Pearl River Delta and the coast of China, and the rates are quite astronomical. And we thought, well, maybe this is just an anomaly in South China on the coast, since a lot of the Chinese policies have been directed to the coast. So we conducted a study in Chengdu in the Sichuan province of China, and we found actually very similar patterns and rates of growth there as well. And one of the very interesting things here is that the remote sensing analysis shows that most of the growth occurs here in the west and in the south, but actually most of the policies were directed at growth in the north and in the east. So we actually have very little understanding of the drivers of the spatial configuration of urban growth. So the two examples I showed are from China, and I just want to highlight that these patterns of urbanization, land change, are occurring not only in China, but also in other parts of the world. And this is some work that we've done in Qatar. And this is Doha in 1973 and some satellite cities in 1973. And very similar to cities in China, we're seeing quite a bit of expansive and extensive development over a 20-year period. And this is not limited to Asia. And in fact, a lot of studies around the world, even in North America, have shown similar patterns. Again, this is work that we've done here in Silicon Valley. And most of the development in Silicon Valley also took place in prime agricultural lands. So that's one of the main themes that I want to leave you all with, is how and where urban areas have and will develop will affect every aspect of our lives in the coming decades. And I recognize that probably most everyone here is not interested in urban issues and urban areas the way Mark and I can talk about urbanization for a long time. But be it biodiversity or food production or climate change or energy consumption, whether cities grow in a compact fashion or expansive. Mark already touched on water stress, whether urban areas grow in water-constrained areas or whether they're in coastal zones, or whether cities really grow up and again, another picture of Shenzhen. And this is a picture taken from National Geographic, which is of a region north of Beijing. Whether cities grow up or out will have significant impacts on Earth system functioning, and again, every aspect of life, not just in the countries where urbanization is happening, but really worldwide. So, from our various studies around the world, one of the things that we have found is that there's very little understanding of global patterns of urban land use change. Our understanding of what's happening tends to be limited to individual case studies, similar to the ones that I just showed you for Doha and for Shenzhen. And we have very little understanding of the global trends, the global patterns. So, for example, we don't have an estimate of global or regional rates of urban land change. We don't know whether the most productive agricultural lands are being lost to urbanization. If we try to forecast energy demand, we have to know something about whether cities are being developed so that people need to rely on transportation systems or private vehicles, and we don't have that basic kind of spatial configuration about cities. So in response to this lack of information, my group and the IHDP Project on Urbanization and Global Environmental Change, for the last couple of years, we've been conducting this meta-study of peer-reviewed studies on urban land use change. And I'm going to show just a couple of the highlight results here. And one of the, I think, surprising things for me is that of all the peer-reviewed studies that have been published, there have been only 291 cities or urban regions that have been monitored in terms of looking at land change. So we've looked at 335 case studies, but of those 335 peer-reviewed studies, only 291 cities are actually covered. If we look at the breakdown of the areas that are being studied, there are a lot of studies. So this is in percentage and numbers. We see that a lot of the studies are in China. There are a number of studies in North America. But if we go to Africa, India, Southeast Asia, and the rest of East Asia, there are very few studies about urban land use change. If we look at the cities that have grown over the last 20 years, so these are charts adapted from the UN. And in 1980, Tokyo was the largest city, and Tokyo's gone down in rank. New York has gone down in rank. New York is now somewhere down here. If we look at the cities and how they've changed in size in terms of population, and we compare it to what we know in terms of land change, we see that of these cities, there are not all the cities are actually covered by the meta-analysis. And so that's another surprise, that you would envision that the cities that were the biggest in 1980 would have been monitored with remote sensing or some kind of empirics like remote sensing. So one of the key points is that we are not monitoring spatially very rapidly growing urban agglomerations. I'm just going to skip over this slide and show you some other results from the analysis. These are average annual rates of growth during the study period. And really the study period starts in 1972 through 2000. And these are annual rates for the entire period. And on the bottom, these are increases in urban areas during that same period. The point that I want folks to take from this slide here is these are just estimates of urban land change from the peer-reviewed studies, which shows that a lot more urban areas were developed in North America than in China during this 30-year period. And again, if you just aggregate the total numbers, the total area of urban land change over this about 30-year period, we see that there's about an area of 58,000 square kilometers that have been converted from farmland or other ecosystems to urban areas, which is roughly twice the size of Maryland or twice the size of Belgium. If we start looking at annual average rates of change per decade, So the previous slide lumped it all together for the 30-year period. Now we're looking at decades. We see that there's a lot of variation in East Africa, East Asia, and in China, but there's actually very little variation in the rates of change in North America. So this is telling us that cities in North America, in terms of their footprint, are growing at about the same rate annually during these decades, less than 5%, and that the range of growth is not very great. And in contrast, if we look at China or East Asia, here in China we see that there's a very large variation. In Central and South America, there's a very large variation, and that basically is a reflection of differences in policies between coastal and non-coastal areas, bigger cities and smaller cities. And if we compare these average annual rates of change of land change to urban population change, this is what I think is one of the most interesting results from the study. And we've been running models to quantify this. And basically what the results show is that across the board, for many regions of the world, urban land change is happening at a faster rate than population change. So in terms of the amount of land required to support the urban population in the decades to come, we're increasingly going to need more and more more land will increasingly be converted to urban uses. So what are the implications of not knowing? So what? You know, we haven't known for a long time, and just because we have these NASA assets, what's the big deal? I would argue a couple of things. One is that we're not able to evaluate the effectiveness of policies, whether it's urban policy or whether it's some type of economic policy to derive or direct land development. Another increasing, really a big issue, I think, at the global scale is land conservation efforts. And if we're interested in saving biologically most productive areas or biological hotspots, we need to think increasingly at the global scale and look at areas that are growing in terms of urban expansion. I think in today's climate, and especially following on Mark's discussion about urbanization and climate change, in terms of energy consumption and greenhouse emissions, the spatial configurations of these cities and the 2 billion urban dwellers that are going to be added to the Earth in the next 30 years will have a huge impact on energy consumption. And I know that I've probably made a number of enemies by saying we're not going to solve the energy crisis by giving everyone a hybrid car, and we're not going to solve the energy crisis by having green buildings. I think green buildings are part of the solution. Hybrid cars are part of the solution. But if we develop cities so that people are zoned to live here, but they're zoned to work here, and the two should never meet other than by a road and a hybrid car, we're certainly going to dig ourselves in a bigger mess. And so in many ways, I would argue that the energy policies and climate policies really need to take into consideration urban policies and how cities are developing. Mark mentioned this a little bit, adaptation to climate change, and I would like to just touch on this point of co-benefits and really triple benefits of thinking about how cities can be reimagined or developed in the decades to come, and how they are developed can both help mitigate climate change, but also help provide more or direct more effective policies for adaptation. So currently, a lot of the policies at local levels is we need to develop very quickly. We need to develop our urban infrastructure. We need to bring Microsoft in to develop our city economy. And then once we are developed, we'll think about climate change afterwards. And there really is an enormous opportunity, and really I would argue this is low-hanging fruit in terms of thinking about how cities can develop in the future. This is one of my big issues is agricultural land. And we've been doing studies in China that show that most of the land that's being converted to urban uses are prime agricultural land. And many case studies around the world are showing this. But we don't have a global snapshot of the most productive agricultural lands. And even if we were to say urban areas only take about 3 to 5% of the Earth's terrestrial surface, the question is how many, or what are the increases in energy, water, and fertilizers required to increase yields in more marginal lands? So there clearly is a trade-off between how we develop our cities and agricultural production. And there is a growing literature beyond the literature on urban heat island effect, which is showing that urban growth and the pattern of urban growth has effects on not only the temperature of local areas, but certainly precipitation at local and at regional scales. So not knowing how urban areas are changing and how they've changed in the past has huge implications across a number of different fronts. So a couple of final points. One point is a plea to federal agencies out there that despite more than 30 years of satellite observations, our understanding about urban land change is relatively small and it's fragmented. We know about urban land change through individual case studies, but we need much more concerted studies and efforts to understand at a global scale what's happening across regions. And we need to have many more studies for smaller and medium-sized cities. For many regions around the world, urban land change is faster than urban population change. So again, if we think about the estimated 2 billion new urban dwellers over the next 20 to 30 years, the rate of growth of urban population is going to be smaller than the land required to support them. And so where these lands will come from, whether they're in arid areas or coastal zones, will have implications for all the issues that I touched upon previously: energy use, greenhouse gases, adaptation, etc. So I'll end there, and I think we'll have some time to take questions. Thank you.
So Bob and Karen and Mark, if you can join us back up here while we get the microphones for a discussion. Thank you both very much. You gave us a lot to work with, and I will just remind everyone, because we are webcasting, ask that you wait for a microphone to come to you and let us know who you are and where you're from, and make it a question and not an additional lengthy comment, because we don't have too much time, and I know with this audience we're going to have a lot of questions and comments. So who would like to kick us off? Gentleman in the middle, and we'll go to the back.
Hi there, I'm David Rain from George Washington University. I guess I would like to ask both of the speakers about what they see as the governmental role in these areas. One is providing housing for the 2 billion people who are going to be moving to cities or going to be in cities, in data collection, and specifically censuses, since we're almost at 2010 and we got the 2010 round coming up, and also in planning. Mark mentioned planning. I'd like to hear more about that, particularly since planners often work at the local level, not the national level, without often very much data or very much support. Thanks.
Okay, Mark or Karen, would you like to take those, or should we can certainly, why don't we collect a couple, because I think we're going to have a lot. So Brian, if we could go to the gentleman in the back row.
Yeah.
And we'll go down the middle. Yeah.
Thank you.
Do you guys have something to write on? Yeah, give you.
My name is David Leibson, and I'm associated with the International Housing Coalition. And it's a little bit of a related question, is whether anybody is now or is going to be looking at mapping of slums within the urban context, both as it relates to the poor and their use of resources, all the socioeconomic, political data that goes with that, and with the land use patterns, use of land, very different than, for example, the high-rise kinds of things you're seeing in China. So the question is whether anybody is or is going to be looking at land as part of your mapping.
Okay, why don't we get the lady in the purple right in the middle?
Hi, my name is Mindy Reiser. I'm a sociologist, worked in Central Asia, and associated with the United Nations Association. I'd like to mention an interesting name, Aldo Solari. and the Arcosanti project. Some people see him as a visionary, some people have seen him as an eccentric. I wonder if his ideas are taken seriously, and I wonder if you even know what I'm referring to.
I don't.
No, I don't.
Oh, all right, very quickly. The idea was and is a community that would be going high in the sky. It's a city that's basically a huge structure which would have opportunities for agriculture and all kinds of urban functions, but it would be very centralized in this huge tower-like edifice which is under construction now for many years. Is it in California or Arizona? Arizona, yeah.
All interesting things in Arizona, right? So, Mark and Karen, would you like to take those three, and then we'll get another round and go?
Great. Thanks so much for the questions. I'll lead off with David's asking about the role of government in providing housing and in organizing, thinking about planning, and so on. As many of you no doubt know, there's another large trend afoot in poor countries, which is the tendency for decentralization, for activities and budgets that used to be concentrated at the national level to be reallocated or foisted upon lower levels of government. And I think for urban areas, this is an especially interesting and profound development, because what it means is that the responsibilities for planning, for service delivery, revenue raising, and so forth are increasingly being given to units of government that have very little experience themselves in conducting these exercises. So I think in the case of Accra, where David is working, people who are increasingly in charge of planning are acting at our municipal actors with very little by way of technical expertise, although better than in some of the smaller cities of Ghana. So there are some real difficulties there in understanding how, in an era of decentralization and urbanization, these sort of conflicting demands will be reconciled. In terms of slum mapping, you mentioned, I think that's an area, as I understand it, of very active interest in the remote sensing community. Also, it's an area that should be of greater interest, I think, within the demographic and socioeconomic, social science communities. One of the things that we are learning is that, for instance, in the case of India, if you ask, thinking about all the urban poor in India, what percentage of those urban poor live in slums? Well, the official estimate would be 20%. That's probably understated substantially. It might be 40%, but it's not the majority, I think. And so the notion of equating, as we all tend to do, I think, slum dwellers and the urban poor is a notion that needs very close examination. I don't think remote sensing is likely to discover urban poor who live outside slums. So we probably need to be aware of that limitation from the outset. And then in terms of the vertical organization of city life, well, I thought one of the things we'd learned in the United States was that housing relatively poor people in vertical structures was a bad idea. So perhaps there's a different way of thinking about it that turns it into a good idea.
Very diplomatic.
Just to add a couple of points, I think, and Bob can probably clarify this, I think SESIN is doing some slum mapping, and so probably in some time we'll see some global or at least regional slum mapping product from them. Folks at SESIN are nodding, shaking, so I'll direct you all to SESIN, but I know that they're doing something about slum mapping. I did want to underscore Mark's comment about decentralization, because that was something that he and I spoke about very briefly before our presentations, that in our local case studies around the world, we're definitely seeing that as one of the characteristics of urban development, a decentralization of a lot of municipal services, and that has a number of different implications in terms of directing urbanization. I mean, on the one hand, decentralization, many people are arguing, is what is driving a lot of the development. And there is this myth of planning that, especially in places like China, there's a myth that Chinese planners come in and they have a plan for the cities, and then it's all really organized, when in fact there are so many different stakeholders and multiple levels of governance and administration that really it's incredibly chaotic, and that planners don't really know what's happening. And in terms of what governments to do, I mean, I think it depends on whether we're talking about North American cities or developing country cities, and even within developing country cities, whether you're talking about Shanghai or whether you're talking about a smaller community in China. I think here in the U.S., right now, especially with the interest in climate change adaptation and a lot more attention to adaptation in cities, that there really is an enormous opportunity to think about housing and think about issues of energy and transportation infrastructure in cities, and that in many ways this is the time for us to think about an urban policy that is a comprehensive energy and transportation policy, and not to think about them in silos. I did want to comment also on the Solari project. Because in China, if you look at the cities and their density compared to pre-reform, so pre-1978, thereabouts, cities now are much denser. But if you bring in Jane Jacobs' type of ideas about what makes a city vibrant, cities are actually less vibrant now than they were 30 years ago, and they're less walkable. So somehow we need to develop a metric that is beyond density. We need to have different numerators. Maybe we have the same denominator on there about area, but we need to have different numerators. And so I don't know if having simply a tall structure would solve the issue of resource use and efficiency. The one thing that I've seen in Japan, which I think is pretty effective, and hasn't, there might be other cases around the world, but zoning across 3 dimensions. So within a building, you will have residential, commercial, small businesses. There'll be a hotel that starts on the 19th floor, and then there's an office building, an office section between like the 10th and 13th floor. And I think there, if we think about cities and break them down into smaller units, into districts and neighborhoods, again, a la Jane Jacobs, there probably is more opportunities for sustainable urban development in that regard.
Okay, terrific. All right, why don't we take some more questions? We go down here, and then the gentleman over here, and we'll get these in the middle.
I'm Paul Voss from the University of North Carolina. In the, past 50 years of modern population forecasting, one of the roles that population forecasts have served is to sort of mobilize constituencies to ensure that future doesn't in fact unfold. Is there anything in the forecasts that you've shown us today that you would point to as a seed of perhaps defeating those projections rather than accepting them as in fact the future that we're all going to face?
Okay, here we go, the gentleman right here, and then we'll come back and Dale.
Yes. I'm Warren Robinson. I guess I would describe myself as a retired academic. This is an enormously impressive effort to collect data from different sources and organize it in a way that makes it possible to know more about each of the data sets than we did to start with. I wonder if in collecting this, you were guided by any kind of theoretical or conceptual expectations about the pattern that might emerge. I'm thinking of the fact that going back a long time in the history of urban studies, you had things like the size rank rule, which suggested that there was a pattern, a kind of natural order into the way in which cities organized themselves, and that this would be predictable. Or a little later, when Wilbur Zielinski was talking about mobility and migration, he found that there were patterns that he called the mobility transition, drawing obviously on the notion of the fertility transition. And there have been other efforts of this sort to posit theoretical patterns or regularities, which would obviously be very helpful for understanding what's going on and for policy too.
Terrific. And then Kayla, if you could go right in the middle, and then Brian, if you could bring that down to Dale down front, and then we'll take those four.
Hi, John Cromarty. I work at the Department of Agriculture here in Washington. Tokyo has California's population in an area the size of Los Angeles or something like that. In your message that the form of the city is very crucial in terms of the linkages with climate change and environmental. Isn't there a really simple message here that compact is better? Is it that simple, or am I simplifying it too much? And do we dance around that because people don't want to hear it?
Okay, Brian, right here in the middle. Well, then we'll give you guys a chance.
I'm Dale Quattrochi from NASA at Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama. I was curious because of the fact that even though the vast majority of the people on the Earth live in urban areas, that we don't really know a whole lot about the characteristics of urban areas around the world. That is, how they developed, whether it's migration or whether it's other factors related to population, just the physical and environmental characteristics of the city. I wonder if you would think about actually developing a catalog of cities around the world so we could actually do better analysis and comparison between cities to understand their overall growth rates, what makes them grow and how they grow.
Okay. Just a couple of questions there. Mark and Karen?
I can go ahead. Just a quick answer to your question. Actually, that's one of the goals of our meta study is to start thinking about a topology of cities across various axes. One being population, and then the other one being land, and then the third being economics. And very recently, we've been thinking about institutions in these areas so that we can start slicing or categorizing these cities by whether they're growing fast vis-a-vis their institution and their governance structures. So that's an easy question. The gentleman from the Department of Ag, the question about is compact better and is it as simple as that? I've been asking that same question myself, and the conclusion that I've come to so far is that it isn't that simple, and in part because of what's in the numerator and what's in the denominator. That if we think about compact as primarily population over land, well, you want a lot of people over a little bit of land. But then if you think about industries and the different types of industry, so if you think about primary or secondary or tertiary sectors of the economy and whether it's light industry or manufacturing industry, well, how do you start thinking about compactness there? Would you actually want the most polluting industries very, very compact? Well, you probably don't want polluting industries at all, and so you export them to places where you can still be very compact and very, very green, let's say. But I think the other challenge with the measurement issue or the empirics issue is if we simply look at population, we discard the livability index of cities, which is absolutely critical. And that to me is one of the really disquieting trends that I'm seeing around the developing world where I've been working for about 15 years, that these cities are becoming very, very dense, not walkable. Despite the fact that they're much denser than North American cities, you need to get in a car to get places because, and again, despite the fact that there's very little zoning, the forces that are driving urbanization are such that you'll have your services, whether it's grocery stores or let's say your barber shop, very far from where you actually live. And so for basic daily services, people in places like Beijing still need to commute incredibly far. And so I think that is one of the biggest challenges now, that we're developing these cities that are growing very, very quickly. I go to China roughly 2 to 3 times a year, and I've been going to my study site in the Pearl River for about 15 years. And thank goodness for NASA's Landsat images, because I go and they're much more up to date than the maps that are being generated. And in fact, even drivers that I hire will say, the road doesn't go there, and I say, well, yes, it does. The adage, Rome wasn't built in a day, and I keep saying, well, cities now are being built in a day, and I think that is probably, so that then goes to the retired academics question about theory, that I think that the patterns and the drivers of urbanization that we've seen historically beyond 50 years, really over the last 100 to 200 years, are very, very different drivers than what we see today. And I think two very different trends are globalization, certainly, and the role of foreign capital in driving urbanization. So whether it's, I keep using Microsoft, but in several of our case studies, Microsoft has been a very big magnet for drawing other industries into an area, whether it's Bangalore, whether it's Shenzhen, and then that then generates linkages of various other industries. So globalization and certainly the international capital. But in terms of your question about rank size rule, I have a paper that I will show you afterwards, and this is something that we have looked at. And surprisingly, the cities that we've looked at in China do follow a power law rule, and much to our surprise, because a lot of the work there has not been looking at change either. It's been looking at city size. But for the few cities that we've looked at in terms of looking at change, there seems to be a power law associated with that. But much more needs to be done there.
To Paul's question about whether city growth or urban growth forecasts that have an alarming aspect to them, will they galvanize efforts that ultimately take the realities to a different place? Well, the UN has been projecting city and urban growth every 2 years since the late 1970s. And those of us who are demographers, as in the population community, have been ignoring those alarming forecasts regularly issued for that period. If you look at the annual meetings of the Population Association of America and ask, where do we find recognition even of the role that urbanization is playing, where do we find treatments of measurement error and so forth, we don't find it. So something isn't getting through, at least in our fields. And I think to respond to Warren's comment, do we approach a study like this with a sense of that sort of theoretical architecture that is partly theoretical, partly empirical? The fact that demographers, international demographers, have all but given up analysis of censuses in favor of analysis of sample surveys, which for very good reasons, not without reason, but means that we no longer come into the field or come into an area with a well-informed knowledge of things like the rank size rule. Does it hold in Bangladesh? We've stopped investing, as we population people have stopped investing in these areas, and it's, I think, time to start again.
Okay, Bob, you want to?
Yeah, actually, I wanted to comment a couple things. One, is that there was a group at Princeton, I think, that came and used our settlements database as a sampling frame for creating a random sample of cities of all different sizes that they were going to develop much more detailed data on, so they could do the kind of study, but not trying to do the huge number of settlements, that would take years, but to actually have a viable sample that you could do some of these studies on. And I'm actually not sure of the current state of that study, but that's one of the applications of this kind of data. I think one of the interesting things about GRUMP that motivated us originally was the fact that the urban definition varied from country to country and was not consistent, and therefore could lead to biases and problems in how people were defining and doing international comparisons of urbanization. So this gives us another way of being a little more consistent across countries and objectives, so that you could do this kind of empirical work, which Mark just alluded to. So I think that's one of the reasons that we're very motivated to keep up the data flow and look at places where that can be done, and you can ask questions like, is compact better or not? Just since I live outside New York City, where people have argued, well, New York City itself is better from a climate change view than others. The problem is disaggregating Manhattan from the whole metropolitan area and saying, well, you have this dense population, but then you have this, to use your word, urban sprawl, your terrible word, around the city. You know, how do you separate those problems out? They're not really separable from a economic, ecological, demographic perspective, and so I think it's a pretty complicated question to answer.
Okay. Unfortunately, we've come to the end of the time. I know there are more questions, and I'll urge you to come ask them directly. But on behalf of the Wilson Center and our Environmental Change and Security Program, and I should have mentioned our Comparative Urban Studies Program, and also SESIN in Columbia, I want you to join me in thanking our panelists for excellent presentation.
Very complimentary.
We didn't